into it. And the first stop was at Barbados. Right, could we have the next slide, please? This is a map of the Caribbean. Barbados is sort of right on the edge of the arc of islands out there. That was where the head of the command was, and the principal medical officer and the governor. So he had to, as it were, clock in there, and then he took a steamboat, the steamboat to Antigua, where he had been posted. Right, let's have the next slide, please. Thank you. This is an interesting picture. At those days, before photography, people who with artistic tendencies were encouraged to make sketches of the places they were at, especially in the Royal Navy with regard to coastlines. Now, this is one of an amazing book of sketches by Colonel Wally Light, which is in the British Library, and this is the Antiguan coast. It's rather flat, and he's got a variety of vessels here. There's a 74, and there's a little lugger here, and a little xebec there, and another little sailing boat over there, and you see the flat contours of Antigua. He arrived in Antigua and went ashore at the port of St. John's. Can we just have, this is a modern map. St. John's is the current port, and this was described by Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is without exception the prettiest harbour I ever saw. I haven't been there, but if you see pictures of there today, there are these like blocks of flats there with big cruise liners, which of course completely spoil the ambiance. So from the town, they landed at St. John's. They went down here to Shirley Heights, named after a soldier called Shirley. And there they found, could we have the next slide, please? They found the barracks. And this is another one of Wally Light's drawings. The pretty standard designs, the barracks here, and the next one shows the hospital. Yes, that's right. Which also is really the barracks, slightly expanded, and a very typical military hospital of the early 19th century. Those buildings were situated at Shirley Lights above English Harbour, a commanding view overlooking the harbour on the southern coast. And that was a haven much shaped by Nelson, who was stationed there. Nelson was actually married on a nearby island. He married a widow called Fanny Nisbet on nearby island of Nevis, and in 1787. And she was the widow of a physician, and she was given away by Prince William, who subsequently became William IV, the sailor king. He was quite a tough, gruff guy, William IV. Remarkably, on Antigua, emancipation had taken place on one day. In many of the West Indian islands, particularly Jamaica, the emancipation had been done with great reluctance by the planters. And in Antigua, one day there was slavery, on the next day there wasn't. And it worked exceptionally well to the subsequent benefit of all members of the community. Antigua is an island richly supplied with a variety of edible vegetables and fruit, very much in tune with Dr. Barry's own vegetarian preferences. Next slide, please. Here is a market. This comes from the Lewis Walpole Library. It's a typical informal little market, a few soldiers wandering around, and you get small people with a few vegetables or some fruit or something like that, which was the way things went at that time. Many of these vegetables and fruit appeared strange to anyone from the British Isles. And root vegetables included yams, sweet potatoes, cassava and eddos, as well as an abundance of fruits, mangoes, guavas, the sort of things that we're sometimes familiar with here. One that caught my eye was a fruit called a dildo, which and I thought I'd look that up, and it was a type of prickly pear of a phallic shape, and I think it makes one positively wince the thought of a prickly pear being used for those purposes. But there you are. These are the things that crop up if you do a bit of research. An advantage enjoyed by local medicine men was that a large number of the plants had medicinal properties, and some were used or are still used in the principles are used in anesthesia, particularly today, for like neostigmines and so on. And now, in autumn 1840, Barry was called back from Antigua to the Barbados, which was where the principal medical officer worked, because the PMO was retiring. And Dr. Draper was retiring. Barry had met Draper on Jamaica years before, and Inspector General Dr. Bone, which is an appropriate name for a surgeon, was yet to assume his post. So for nearly 2 years on Barbados, Barry was the locum principal medical officer, and he did so well that he was actually mentioned in dispatches, and he was proud to mention this in his final memorandum to the board, the medical board. But after that, next slide please, he went, here's our friend again, these are the Leeward Islands, Windward Island, and that's Antigua. He was then posted to Trinidad as the principal medical officer. So he next had a lot of, there's Barbados, so it's Trinidad, Barbados, and then to Trinidad. And Barry was sailed for PMO. It was a strange twist of fate that as the inter-island steamer approached Trinidad, let's have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, as the inter-island steamer approached Trinidad from down there, he could see across, this is a strait here, across to this area, which was Venezuela, which was the revolution in Venezuela that was the whole factor in the background why Barry actually went and did medicine in the first place. So you remember General Miranda was going to do that, and his revolution failed, and so here was Barry at this stage of his life approaching Venezuela. Now this is the Gulf of Paria over here between Trinidad and Venezuela, and next slide please. You can see the water of that Gulf doesn't have the Caribbean blue which is usually there, but it has this greenish color, and that is because two huge rivers drain tributaries from the Orinoco system and the Amazon system, both drain into the Gulf of Paria. And so the water is far less saline, and it gets entirely different sort of flora growing in it. Next slide, please. The Port of Spain is the capital of Trinidad, and this here you see a variety of interest. And there's a brig, and I think there's another brig somewhere, and here's a lugger, and a couple of little boats around, and it was just a beach. There was no actual harbour there. The anchorage was simply a shallow bay on a long curved beach with a wooden jetty, somewhat reminiscent of Table Bay. One description described views which exuded warmth and colour adding a very foreign feel, with feluccas, canoes and other odd-looking craft skimming about, and Indians, Spanish Americans, French, English, Bengal coolies, Scotch and Negroes from all sorts of places speaking all sorts of tongues. So that was from a contemporary traveller. British troops were headquartered at St James's Barracks, which were down that way, which wasn't a very healthy area because it got a bit waterlogged in the winter. As elsewhere, most of the morbidity and mortality amongst white troops was due to fevers and diarrheal disorders, while it was smallpox and tuberculosis which plagued the black soldiers. In view of their susceptibility to smallpox, Barry instituted wide-scale inoculation, vaccination for the members of the West India Regiment. The West India Regiment, incidentally, was a regiment composed entirely of black soldiers who were virtually all freed slaves. Next slide, please. Now, the other diseases there, this disease was we hadn't come across before. This is a very unpleasant condition caused by the smallest flea of all the fleas, a thing called a chigger flea or a jigger flea. And they get onto the skin of the lower leg, because the fleas live on the ground, and they get on the skin, they burrow in, and they stay there for good. They don't... Once the jigger flea's got its home, that's where he stays. And they cause these dreadful, this dreadful skin eruption, and there's no treatment for this other than amputation. And so there would, this type of thing was virtually only seen on Trinidad in the West Indies, but it occurs elsewhere in Africa, West Africa as well. Chronic alcoholism and delirium tremens were a fact of life in the British Army, especially amongst the white soldiers. It was the old story. Not only did the soldier receive his daily ration of rum from the army, and it should be remembered the daily ration was not a 750 milliliter bottle we get today, but two-thirds of that, 500 ml, a pint of rum every day for every soldier. There was never any chance of a shortage of rum, never. And if the chap managed to down his rum by the time lunchtime arrived, there was always a vendor standing outside the barrack gate who were ready to sell him more rum. So the clinical picture of chronic alcoholism became all too familiar. Many of us know somebody who has been a chronic alcoholic. Can we have the next slide, please? I don't know, is the name Ilya Repin, the artist, familiar to anybody? He was an amazing, absolutely outstanding Russian artist. I first saw his work when my wife and I were in St. Petersburg at the Russian Museum. And it's extraordinary, this artist is so little known outside. This is the composer Modest Mussorgsky, who had been in the Russian army. He'd become an alcoholic. He was friendly with Repin, and this is a painting that the artist did of his friend a matter of weeks before he died. But if you look at him, you can see very typical faces of a chronic alcoholic. Shaggy, he's unkempt, shaggy beard. He's got this distant look on his slightly watery eyes. And it's not only that, it's the rest. The liver function is disturbed, and so the patient gets a lot of estrogen, so the man then grows breasts, and his testicles get smaller, and it just is chronic alcoholism is a disaster. And even worse, if the man is used to having alcohol every day, his pint, if that is stopped for some reason, say that he has an accident and breaks his leg or whatever else it is, and put into hospital and doesn't get his alcohol for the next few days, a condition called delirium tremens develops. That is because the alcohol, our nervous system has two balanced functions. There's a stimulatory function and an inhibitory function. And what happens with the alcohol, it inhibits the body's own inhibitory function. So if it stops, the alcohol stops, the inhibitory function is not working, but the stimulatory function goes absolutely wild. And psychologically, it causes the delirium. That's why they see rats running around and that sort of thing. And the stimulatory function of the motor function, they get the tremor. So it's a delirium tremens. And Sir James MacGregor at the headquarters of the British Army was desperately trying to find out how they could stop and deal with this. The answer was no alcohol. But Barry had his own, a patient said to him, the weather is always so hot, rum is always so cheap, and the man is always so dry. And Barry's realistic opinion was that perhaps the only way it changes was to embark the patients on a temperance vessel and send them to a cold climate. And that probably is the sum of it. If the temptation of alcohol just has to be taken away, and that's very difficult. Dr. Barry was to remain in Trinidad until December 1845. On the whole, he enjoyed a relatively quiet time. There wasn't too much sickness. The garrison was well provided for, and the medical service ran smoothly, apart from compiling reports from headquarters. And in this agreeable environment, he had both the time to socialize in the finest circles on the island. And Barry was very good at socializing. Later years, reminiscences were to flow. And about 50 years after this, in the 1890s, an American naval doctor was seconded to Britain, and he'd heard about this Dr. Barry and wanted to find out something about him. And nobody could really say anything. So there was an article written in a letter to the editor of The Lancet, and that proved extremely valuable to us who were interested in Barry, because there was still a large number of men who actually worked with and remembered Dr. Barry, even though it was sort of 50 years later. And Lieutenant Colonel Rogers, who knew Barry well at that time, he showed considerable empathy when recollecting his own impressions some 50 years later. He described Barry as being imperious in manner and officially dictatorial in social circles. In social circles, she was admired and respected. She was, moreover, sympathetic and skillful in her profession. And yet, what a life of repressed emotion she must have led. A woman, too, of whom it was said that she gave birth to a child in the early days. So we keep getting these opinions about Dr. Barry and Dr. Barry's character, and they all accord with one another, more or less. So it was the tiny mosquito which finally brought an end to Dr. Barry's stay in Trinidad. And not only in Trinidad, but also in the West Indies. Sometime late in 1845, it became apparent that James had at long last personally experienced a visit from a female mosquito carrying the dreaded virus of yellow fever. Now, this same time, 50 years later, the same period when we were getting these things, a retired Colonel Lowry told this story. I was quartered as a subaltern in Trinidad while Dr. Barry was serving there. One day, a friend of mine, an assistant surgeon, a Dr. O'Connor, asked me to walk with him into Port of Spain. The PMO, said he, is down with fever at the house of a lady friend, but he's given strict instructions to us not to visit him. Nevertheless, I feel bound to call and to see him. Will you come with me? On arrival, O'Connor entered Barry's bedroom while I remained on the veranda. In a few minutes, he emerged and called me excitedly into the room, exclaiming as he flung back the sheets, "See, Barry is a woman." And at that moment, that I must say is very unprofessional. Very unprofessional. At that moment, the P&O woke to consciousness and gazed at us in a bewildered manner, but she quickly recovered a presence of mind and asked in a low tones to swear solemnly not to disclose her secret so long as she lived. As a matter of fact, added the Colonel, I have never till now mentioned the subject. In those days, people acted in that sort of way. Today, it's a blabber all the time to the local tabloids, and people just can't keep their traps shut, either there or on social media. So the foregoing proves that just 2 men had on that occasion witnessed the fact that Barry was a woman. And then remember, when she was on the island of Mauritius, there was a woman who'd spoken to a nurse who'd also seen that Barry was a woman. Those are the only 2 occasions during these 50-odd years that Barry's sex was actually discovered by someone else. And that says something for the integrity of people who promise not to speak. Although James Barry's years in the Windward and Leeward Command had resulted in prolonged, serious and debilitating ill health, he was fortunately amongst the 85% of people to survive yellow fever. Once he was well enough to withstand the stress of a long transatlantic voyage, which was on Boxing Day 1845, he managed to board a ship and he went back to England. Once recovered, and before being sent to his next post, he attended a levee of Queen Victoria at the palace, where he was presented to the Queen by Lord Lonsdale, who was a friend of Lord Charles Somerset. At this time, in the wider British world, 1839 to 1842, other stuff was happening. I don't know if you've heard of the great game between Russia and Britain at that time. Russia was always the jewel in the crown, as the name of the story goes, was in the British crown was India, and Russia looked at India with hungry eyes, and they often made comments that they might possibly go to India. Well, in the first Anglo-Afghan War, the British Army entered Afghanistan in an ill-judged measure to try to preempt the Russians in the course of the Great Game. It ended with a disastrous retreat from Kabul. Do you know about this? Yeah. It was a horrendous thing. If I tell you that there was only one survivor of this debacle, Dr. Brighton, out of the original 9,500 troops and 38,000 camp followers. So it's nearly 48,000 people, 48,999 of these people died, which is a catastrophe. The matter of this Afghanistan problem only came to a conclusion about 10 years later with the annexation of the Punjab. But as you can see, even from the experience we've had over the last 10 years or so, Afghanistan is a case of its own. Right, let's have the next slide. The navel of the Mediterranean was described by Homer. It is Malta. And Odysseus spent a long time on Malta, on an island ringed by water. It wasn't actually Malta Odysseus was on. It was an island called Gozo, which is just a small island near Malta. Let's have the next slide. Sorry, Malta. It looks pretty insignificant over here, Malta and Gozo, but at that time of history, it was very important because it was like the British had it, and it was like a ship it's not going to sink if it's attacked by another fleet. So that's a very important strategic place for the British force to be. So Calypso detained Ulysses on Gozo for 7 years. Just let's have the next slide, please. There's Malta and there's Gozo, and Calypso detained in there for 7 years and bore him 2 sons into the bargain, so things could not have been as intolerable as Homer said it was. Napoleon bagged Malta for France on his way to Egypt in 1798. But despite his radical reforms measures put in place, the French were never popular, and in 1800 the place fell into British hands under Lord Nelson. Ulysses and Calypso were not the only new parents in the area, because as a footnote in history, Emma Hamilton accompanied Nelson at the time, and their daughter Horatio was conceived during this Maltese episode. Next slide, please. So just go back one. Valletta is down here in Malta, Valletta Harbour, and the next slide shows what Valletta Harbour looks like. It was a very, very secure, easily defended place, and it was of utmost importance to the Royal Navy to have control of this during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, on Monday the 16th of November, let's have the next slide, please, the P&O liner Achilles, the P&O Peninsula and Orient, the peninsula being Spain and the Orient the further east. That was one of the first major British shipping lines to be established. And this is not Achilles. I couldn't find a picture of her, but this is a ship of the same time as Achilles. This one is equipped with a screw propeller, but you'll see that she has the lines of a sailing ship, and she has still three masts and sails in case the motor gave up. So aboard the ship, the principal medical officer was not, by no means, the most important best passenger on board. Can we have the next slide, please? This is the shipping record from the time aboard Achilles. His Excellency Sir Patrick Stewart was with his family were the first people, and then Dr. James Barry and servant came after that. So Sir Patrick Stewart had been on leave in England, and now he was returning to his post at Malta, and Dr. Barry was here with his servant to take up the post. The 12-day passage had been smooth, but this was the first time Barry had gone to a new post on a steamer, and it sort of signalled that things in his own life, or her own life, were starting to change. Men from the garrison formed a guard of honour on the quay side next to the vessel, and there was a lot of ceremony, which Barry had to wait for that to pass before she went down. Let's have the next slide. Malta is a spectacular place. I haven't been to Malta, but this is part of the harbour side, which you can see is really an exquisitely beautiful place, which fortunately hasn't been too damaged by the wars which have come. Let's have the next slide, please. This gives the Maltese harbour is very complicated. This is the Grand Harbour. Over here is a quarantine harbour with an island for putting lepers on, and then over here was a thing, Slima, which was a place where Barry lodged while living in Malta. And her landlord always maintained that Barry was a woman. He said he used to swear that Barry was a woman because of the obstinate manner of her nature. Malta was a popular posting in the army, more so for the officers than the troops, let it be said, as there was a busy social life, plenty of time for recreational pursuits such as the races and assemblies, both of which afforded opportunities to meet the local girls. The annual Governor's Ball was a highlight of the social season and always a grand affair. For the troops, however, balls, masked balls or not, did not feature. Not in that sense of the word. It was booze and broads more or less summed up their predilections. Many men were illiterate, and drunkenness was always an intractable problem. Barry's annual report here was very interesting. It was a recurrent part of Barry's duty to furnish the annual report and sickness of the troops. In one case, as a urologist, I found one case noteworthy for two reasons. The patient was operated on under anesthesia for the first time. It was an innovation at that time, in 1846, and the first time this was reported by Dr. Barry. The man had been seen the previous year with a right-sided scrotal swelling, which turned out to be a tumour, which was removed without an anaesthetic on this occasion. Then, after a lapse of 4 months, the left testicle became diseased. A medullary fungus protruded through the scrotum, rapidly increasing in size, and Surgeon Dawson operated, aided by his assistant Dr. Moorhead, and Surgeon Martin of the Naval Hospital administered ether with a sponge, which appeared occasionally to produce stupor, interrupted by violent shouting, which is not surprising. But this is a case of bilateral synchronous testicular tumours, which are very, very rare indeed. You get testicular tumours in men in the army because those tumours occur between the sort of 20 and 30, or late teens to 30 age group, and that's the age of army soldiers when they're taken on. But this case of bilateral ones I found quite exciting. It hadn't been reported before by that time. But due to its central position in the Mediterranean, the constant sword of Damocles handing over Malta was its vulnerability to cholera. Implications for the vital trade and shipping movements were of cardinal importance, both for the civilians and for the army. And in the event of an epidemic, the place was obliged to shut down until the last patient was dead or better, with no further case reported over a period of 40 days. Hence the term quarantine. 40 days. One doesn't sort of take these things on board until you actually have it explained to you. Anyway, cholera was to define much of Dr. Barry's term of office in Malta. And the matter was seldom free from controversy. A decade before his appointment, there had been a serious epidemic, 1837-38, when half of the 8,500 inhabitants actually died. That's serious cholera. The trouble first surfaced this time on the 6th of September 1848, and the Sanitary Committee's return of cases of cholera on the 19th of October revealed disturbing facts about 23 affected individuals, of whom no fewer than 16 had died. That's quite a heavy mortality, more than 50% mortality rate. The army and the governor needed to know what was going on. So Barry immediately recruited 6 other doctors, mostly regimental or some from the civilian side, to investigate the matter. And they eventually, the following answers were announced. One, that no case of Asiatic epidemic cholera has occurred on the island. And secondly, the island is healthy. In view of the figures, the clinical features, and the approximately 70% mortality rate, which we know, one really has to wonder about this conclusion. Anyway, the PMO's conclusion certainly received popular support, and a penny subscription was talked of to be got up from the island to purchase a suitable piece of plate to be presented to Dr. Barry for his having, in his unremitted exertions and perseverance, saved us from a calamity. So I think Barry got lucky then, because that outbreak of cholera didn't go any further. But in 1850, within 6 months, cholera certainly revisited Malta with a vengeance. This time there was no shilly-shallowing. It was part of another pandemic, with a serious outbreak in London, Liverpool and Hull, and likely the disease arrived in Malta from a vessel coming from one of those ports. The major outbreak, there were 4,029 cases with 1,736 deaths. A mortality rate of 43%, which was thought to be very, very good. Barry's habitual meticulousness regarding the cleanliness and ventilation of the barracks, personal hygiene of the troops and their bedding, all contributed towards what was regarded as an outcome so good that it even came to the notice of the Duke of Wellington, and Barry received a special commendation from the Duke for my services during the period the island was visited by the cholera. Now, Barry's time on Malta came to an end in April 1851. And on Tuesday, 1st of April 1851, April Fool's Day, having taken leave of his colleagues, patients, dignitaries and citizenry, Barry, accompanied by his soldier servant, his batman, and his black servant, boarded HMS Triton, which was an experimental paddle steamer in the Royal Navy. And that was also a reminder to the doctor that times were changing, and a reminder to him of his own aging. So he departed from Malta, and the next place they were going to was Corfu. I've tried to acknowledge any Greek people here, but by writing Corfu in Cyrillic writing, at least capital. The P is the letter Rho in Greece, which is our letter R, Kerkera. And this records the Odysseus' sailing from the island of Gozo to Corfu. Right, let's have the next slide. The British had come into possession of most of the islands in the Ionian Sea, following the Battle of Waterloo and the collapse of France. And they called it the United States of Ionian Islands. They were the main one was Corfu, then Paxos, Lefkos, Megista, Kefalonia, Ithaca, where Ulysses was ultimately trying to get it, and Zakynthos. And just a matter of interest, Lord Byron, whom we met during the year without a summer, he subsequently went and fought for to get the Ottomans out of their empire, and he died over here in the 1820s of malaria. Malaria was quite common in this area. It was one of the causes, more notable causes of death in the soldiers, together with drowning, because surrounded by water, many of the soldiers couldn't swim. So it took Triton about 36 hours to sail from Malta to Corfu, and Barry and his servants went ashore. Let's have a look. Corfu had been in Venetian possession for many, many years, and the military buildings were largely constructed by the Venetians. This over here, I want you to note this bridge here. This was actually joined up to the mainland in Venetian times, but they hacked out a passage here, and when there was only access by this bridge. So this is the citadel for Corfu. Yes, it's a contemporary image, men fishing over here, and that was also the headquarters of the army. Corfu was essentially a healthy station, but I've mentioned malaria and drowning. The rate of illness was low. Just 6 weeks after his arrival on Corfu, Barry received promotion to the rank of Deputy Inspector General. That was quite a jump up for him. He was now a colonel in the army. And that was on the 16th of May 1851. Let's have the next slide, please. There's the citadel, and in the middle of the town itself of Corfu was this Fort Neuf, the new fort. And those two forts, that and the citadel, had the town in between the two, and they proved a very effective method of defense for the citizens over many hundreds of years. Right, let's have the next slide, please. This is Dr. Barry after he'd received his promotion. This is said to be a cartoon done by Edward Lear. And here you see the elderly gent with his characteristic attitude, his cocked hat, long Ciceronian nose, a few locks of hair, his switch for the flies, long there, and he's got a very long sword which he's leaning on, using it almost as a walking stick in one of his animals. And this is a cartoon or caricature which has been reproduced many times. Now, in 1852, after long years of service, Dr. Barry had nearly a year's furlough, and he departed Corfu by steamer and went to England. He stayed in the West End of London, where he felt most comfortable, and while he was there, certain things had been happening. Let's have the next slide, please. Can anybody guess what this might be? This is the funeral of the Duke of Wellington, who died at about that time. And he was the Duke who'd beaten Napoleon at Waterloo, and there was this huge, huge state funeral for him, which probably took up a long bit between the place where he was and the St. Paul's Cathedral. And he was put down, laid to rest next to Nelson in the cathedral. Next slide, please. The actual hearse was colossal. It weighed, I think it weighed 14 tons, something like that. And it was made up of bronze, which were from cannon captured French cannon captured after Waterloo. So it was a very profound thing to be seen. And Barry was in London at that time and saw it. He missed the Great Exhibition, but the Crystal Palace hadn't been taken down by then. Medically speaking, he kept his ear to the ground and could not fail to have been aware of the recent opening of the first hospital exclusively for sick children. That is the Great Ormond Street Hospital, and I was fortunate in spending some time there myself as a student, as a young doctor. And the other thing interesting is that the hospital appointed a matron, a Mrs. Frances Willey, curious name for plastic surgeons. She'd been appointed a matron, and a bit later, a matron was appointed to St. Thomas's Hospital. Now, if you remember, cast your mind back to St. Helena, Barry appointed a matron to the hospital there 16 years earlier. So Barry, in that respect, was very much not a pathfinder, a pioneer in that sort of thing. And matrons like that, I was at St. Thomas's Hospital and Great Ormond Street, and the matron was usually, should we say, a severe or a serious person. And the staff really worked, they respected her, and the staff in the hospitals at that stage were very, very on the ball. It was thought subsequently that it was too authoritarian to have a woman as a matron, and they changed the names to manager, or hospital manager, or something like that, and instead of dressing correctly, they started to wear sort of schlumpfy clothes. And I think that that is one of the reasons why the National Health Service in Britain is in such a mess today, because the discipline of thoroughness is not there. My own sister was the principal matron of Grootske Hospital, I should add, for many years. And when I was on the staff at Grootske Hospital, I had to mind my P's and Q's because I couldn't dare park in the wrong place or misbehave myself in the ward or the theatre, because it would have reflected badly upon my sister. Then there was another thing happened at this time. Queen Victoria had a son, and when he was born, he was in 1853. It was the Duke of Albany. His name was Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, and this was the time when chloroform was being used in preference to ether. And Dr. John Snow gave Queen Victoria a chloroform anaesthetic when Prince Leopold was born. And he was the doctor who distinguished himself long before by finding out how it was that cholera spread. And that was through, he examined the water from the pump in Soho and found that pump had been contaminated by leakage from a sewer. So doctors in those days were very versatile people. They could experiment. And we also have a local connection with Prince Leopold, which he was the father of Princess Alice. Does that ring a bell? Yes? Right, yeah. Princess Alice was married to the Earl of Athlone, so she was Countess of Athlone, and he was the Governor-General in this country in the 20s. There are remnants of... there's the suburb of Athlone named after them. There's... Princess Flay, I think it's named after her, and there was that large house at Musenberg. What is it called, that house? I can't. Does anyone know? There's a big, as you drive down to Musenberg, there's a very big house there, which was. Say again. And also there's an Alice's Ride in Pinelands, and so Princess Alice's. But there's just one thing that I might mention to you. It may be of interest. The Earl of Athlone installed the new nationalist prime minister after the triumph of the Nationalist Party in the general election of 1924. Do you know who that was? It was Mr. James Barry. Well, he was Dr. James Barry Munich Herzog. So things that go around come around. Now, as part of his leave, Dr. Barry had been an appointment and a visit to the British ambassador in Austria had been arranged. The British ambassador was the Earl of Westmoreland, and his wife and Lord Raglan's wife were both sisters. So Dr. Barry was more or less, he couldn't refuse to go to Vienna, and that is the only visit to the continent that I can find with Barry. But he had a warm welcome at the British Embassy. The 11th Earl was a distinguished military had a distinguished military career, and he also, amongst the other things he did, he founded the Royal Academy of Music. He was a polished violinist and composer, so that was quite an interesting little thing. Founder of the Royal Academy of Music. Now he had daughters, one of whom became Lady Rose Weigall, and she wrote an account in The Spectator some years later. She said, "Dr. Barry was asked to dinner, and when he arrived we saw a small man with small features, a very smooth though wizened face, very fair, not red hair, and a most peculiar squeaky voice and mincing manner, the whole effect of which was so irresistibly comic that it kept all the youngest members of the party in agonies of suppressed laughter. All through the dinner, which is probably the reason why my recollection is so vivid," she wrote. "My mother, the Countess, whom he sat next to, however, said that in spite of his ludicrous appearance, his conversation was most interesting." And by the time Barry then had returned to Corfu, events leading to the coming war had developed an unstoppable momentum, and the relatively relaxed days of peacetime were drawing rapidly to a close. As hostility, I'm not going into the Crimean War because it's multiple lectures on its own, so I've asked for a handout. Have you got? Yes. You've got handouts. Okay. Barry's originally volunteered to be a PMO at the Crimean War, but fortunately for him, his offer was rejected because things were not good. As hostilities escalated during the summer of 1854, Barry was involved in a notorious incident at the moat in front of the entrance to the Corfu citadel. Remember I showed and said, just note this. One stinking hot day, this is written in an army document. One stinking hot day at about 2 p.m., Colonel Denny, at the head of his regiment, marched out of the citadel for a drill on the esplanade. This is the esplanade, which the Fort Neuf is at the top there, perhaps a bit exaggerated, but what do you see happening there? Cricket. The Greeks play cricket. There's a Greek sort of cricket league, and the head of the Greek cricket league is on the island of Corfu, because that was brought there by British soldiers. So, this was used at the time. The esplanade was a place for drilling soldiers. So on the drawbridge, Colonel Denny was met by Dr. Barry. A wordy duel ensued, the doctor declaring that he would report the colonel to the commander-in-chief, that is Lord Raglan, who was at the front, at the same time vigorously flourishing his horsehair whip. This struck the colonel in the face, and the enraged officer instantly snatched it from Barry and threw it into the moat, and was about to throw the doctor after it when some kind friend intervened on his behalf. In the end, however, the doctor had his revenge. He declared the colonel to be mad, and backed up by the Lord High Commissioner and the general commanding the troops, he convened a medical board which declared the colonel to be non compos mentis. Shortly afterwards, the gallant regiment embarked for the Crimea and was followed by its late chief, who persistently applied to Lord Raglan to be restored to the command of the troops. His services, however, were declined, much to the satisfaction of the men. So that is another little story about Dr. Barry. Let's have the next slide. This is the scene where there's not a drawbridge there today. This is a modern photograph, but this is where this scene. You can see where the ravine was cut by the Venetians, and it was into that, the water underneath there, the moat that the colonel threatened to throw Dr. Barry. Right, let's have the next one. The Crimean War. This is a quotation from Tolstoy. You will see war not as a beautiful, orderly and gleaming formation, but in its authentic expression as blood, suffering and death. That quotation is in that little book over there. Now, by the middle of October 1855, Barry and his two servants were in Istanbul, which at that time was being called Constantinople. He was unable to resist going to the Crimea to see for himself what was going on, although by that time the actual hostilities had ceased, but there was still a whole lot of clearing up to do. It was in Constantinople in mid-October 1855 that Dr. Barry and Miss Florence Nightingale had their notorious and only encounter in the great rectangular parade ground. Could you have the next? Sorry. The Crimea. You all know the Black Sea up there, and the Crimea is there. It was captured by the Russians rather later because it was a Turkish possession for many, many years. This is down in Istanbul, and the next slide shows you this building, which is an amazing building. This is the Selimiye barracks. They were put up by Sultan Selim III in the late 18th century. That barrack is huge. I visited it myself on an occasion, and it's the headquarters of the Turkish First Army. And it has a huge quadrangle, really big, which is a parade ground, and facing the quadrangle of a series of loggias. And Florence Nightingale was given one loggia on the opposite side to that for her hospital. And in this little tower over here, she had her bedroom at the top, a room, a sort of a sitting room in the second one down, and then her office was at the bottom, adjacent to the hospital. So it was there in Constantinople that he had his only meeting with Nightingale. Next slide, please. Here is a rather imaginary picture. When I was at this place, I don't seem to remember seeing this type of vaulting there, and there definitely were no windows in it. There were semicircular places for air to come in, but they were not glazed. So there's the lady with the lamp, and the lamp, incidentally, doesn't look like that sort of classical lamp that you always see. It was more like a lantern, like a little concertina hanging lantern, and that lamp is to be seen in Florence Nightingale's office today. So accountant were there. The only account of this was in Nightingale's own handwriting. So next slide, please. This is her in London. She wrote a letter to her sister about this incident. In none of Barry's works is it mentioned at all, just the same as the duel with Captain Clutie wasn't mentioned either. But Nightingale was obviously cut to the quick. The story goes like this: Barry, in full uniform, seated upon his beautiful grey Arab and followed by his mounted servants, entered the parade ground through one of the arched entrances. Although autumn, the weather was still hot and the courtyard drenched in sunlight. James had come here simply out of curiosity to visit these famous barracks of the Ottoman army, one lodger of which was now serving as the British Barrack Hospital. By any standard, this range of buildings occupying a commanding position high above the Bosphorus was spectacular, both in sheer size and pure architectural elegance, and I can vouch for that. From his high vantage point, he spotted in the corner a group clustered around a slightly built woman, dressed in simple black and wearing a delicate white lace cap. Barry slowly urged his horse to move towards the other side of the square. The woman was talking to one of several wounded soldiers, and there were other men, some uniformed, some not, and a couple of nurses, perhaps a dozen persons in all, accompanying her. At first they appeared not to notice the approaching horsemen, but then the officer turned his mount purposefully towards the knot of people and came to a halt in front of them. His companions, one of whom was a black man in civilian clothes, remained further behind. Without removing his hat, Dr. Barry made himself known to Miss Nightingale, courteously enough, but then immediately launched into a tirade, a sharp rebuke, reprimanding her for her stupidity in exposing herself to the heat of the sun in that part of the world while wearing such inappropriate headgear. Far from waiting for any sort of response, he then turned his horse and the trio moved slowly away across the square and out through another entrance. Seldom was Miss Nightingale left speechless, but on this occasion she was dumbfounded. Unable to remember ever having been spoken to in such a manner before, she would never forget this. Her little entourage stood shocked, silent and respectful. At some point after Barry's death, next slide please, oh well here we are, just go back. At some point after Barry's death, Nightingale, from her address in 34 South Street, Park Lane, was to write to her sister Parthenope. As Mr. Whitehead remarks, she wrote, "I will mention that I never had such a blackguard rating, that is such a rowing, in all my life than from this Barry sitting on her, in brackets, horse, while I was crossing the hospital square with only my cap on in the sun. He kept me standing in the midst of quite a crowd of soldiers, commissariat servants, camp followers, etc., every one of whom behaved like a gentleman during the scolding I received, while she behaved like a brute. After she was dead, I was told he was a woman." So Nightingale was mixing her sense. Viewed sympathetically, Barry's antipathy towards Nightingale was understandable. For decades, he had been advocating those very principles of the situation of barracks, their ventilation, the sanitation, the cleanliness, together with concepts of nutritious food and clean water, all with positive results, long years before Nightingale had appeared on the scene. Yet now it was she who was receiving the plaudits, the credit, the public recognition, and the fame for the very same measures. Pent-up emotions within must have spilled over in fury, arising from his wounded feelings as to the woman deep within. In an unexpected final flourish for the PMO prior to leaving Corfu, he received the gift of a magnificent diamond ring from the Archduke Maximilian of Austria. He was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, for services to one of His Imperial Highness's crew. Maximilian was the admiral. You don't too often think of Austria having a navy, but in fact Austria owned the territory round to Trieste at that time. So Maximilian was the admiral and head of the Austrian navy, which under his command had become an effective fighting force. This ill-fated younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, in 1864, to his great misfortune, would be created Emperor of Mexico. This was one of the imperial schemes of Napoleon III, was to found her, and Maximilian was executed 3 years later, an event subsequently immortalized by Manet in this painting. Right, so that is the end of that one, and we will have our last talk tomorrow. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd do my best to answer them. I don't think she would have been executed. I think she would just have been dismissed. Yes. I don't think they would have executed. I'm talking about Dr. Barry's last posting and retirement. Barry was put to Canada, largely due to Nightingale manipulating the Army Medical Department, that has to be said. But he didn't know that at the time. Right.